we're ready. Let's go.
Yes, so let's go.
So good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Here we are with the last of our classes on thinking Christianly about creation. And this will be sort of a wrap up. And I'm going to go to like a few different places here this morning to talk about that. Wrap up is kind of strange talk because clearly this isn't going to be wrapped up. It's not even, I don't even know if it's unwrapped at this point in terms of all the stuff we have to think about with regard to these issues of creation care and global creation crisis, etc. But here we are this morning, and just to recap a little bit, in the first week we focused a lot on the story of creation, and also on the first chapter of John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, John has a creation story at the beginning of his Gospel, and basically he seems to be saying that all creation participates in this divine spirit that's related to the Holy Spirit, and when John uses the term life, that sort of divine life permeates all creation. And to that end, I read a poem that week by Gerard Manley Hopkins called Pied Beauty that says, that God fathers forth throughout creation. That is, the divine life sort of continues to create and is begotten in a sense throughout the whole world. And then the week after that, we had that very stirring presentation by Ched Myers, which is available for you to go back and look to as well. It was very rich, very dense, and looking at the first, basically mostly the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, and then, but looking at it in how human sinfulness is a departure from that wonderful creation story, and that we see this that human sinfulness is exemplified, for example, in the building of the Tower of Babel, which is sort of an image of empires and the pride of human beings. And then last week, of course, we had that fabulous presentation by both Kelly and Eric. And Kelly, giving us that wonderful image from Meister Eckhart about the divine life visible in all created things. And so then we wonder, what can we learn from creation? How can we see some facet of the divine life revealed to us in creation? And then to just ask the question also, with species extinction and the destruction of the planet, how much of the divine disclosure or revelation are we losing when species are destroyed and rainforests are destroyed? How much are we the poorer in being able to enjoy the life of God revealed to us in that way? And then, of course, Eric's sobering reflection on his experience dealing in a very particular way with the bike lanes in the city of Los Angeles, and how the powers and the principalities are at work in such a way, not necessarily in any sort of overt nefarious way that people necessarily want to be evil, but it just sort of permeates the system in such a way that it's difficult to get out of it. And it not necessarily saying that each individual person is a bad actor or whatever, but they and all of us perhaps are caught up in these systems that perpetuate themselves. Am I right, Eric, in terms of am I correctly stating your point there?
Sure, and I just add that I about the danger of individualizing the problem and the need to work together
Yeah.
to get out of it.
Right.
Building on that.
Right. And that, of course, is what Kelly was also saying when she was talking about, my little recycling bottle doesn't really do a whole lot, but when we see the fact that there are, huge garbage piles, of plastics in forming, continents almost in the oceans, and so how do we address that sort of a problem that's far transcends any individual decision making, and it could in fact cause us paralysis. And to that end, I think that I'd like to move on to once again a book that I've referred to before, and I think in the John class and maybe even in this class in the first week, Robert McFarlane's book Underland, and I'd like to reflect a little bit on one chapter of that book. He, as you may recall, if you've been within these classes and heard about McFarlane's book before in some other context, Underland is about he's going all over the globe and exploring what exists under the earth, right? Not just what we can see on top, but what is the world that exists below the surface of the earth. And this particular chapter, he's talking about he's in the Arctic regions of Norway, looking at something that's called the edge in the ocean, and the edge is a drop off of into really deep ocean, and it's a wonderful fishing place because the fish tend to gather at the edge of this big drop off into the ocean, and for generations and generations, people, Norwegian fishermen have been engaging in practices of fishing in sustainable ways. But now in the 21st century, I guess, and 20th century, 21st century, what has happened is the incursion of oil drilling, and also sonic testing of the oceans to map the ocean floor to see where they can put down oil rigs. And this fisherman that he's been talking to in the book, Bjornar, has been doing this his whole life. And he had a similar experience to Eric's. He tried to let the public authorities know that these sonic testings were disturbing fish migrations and whales, and not to mention the drilling itself, and went to a public hearing and realized at that point that all the decisions had already been made, and that this was sort of just a sham. It was window dressing. And at that point, he decided he was going to give his whole life to try to work to change this. And in the midst of all of that, he had a psychotic break, and these things would reappear again in his life in what he called the trances that would happen in his life. So that's all by way of background to where we have Bjornar speaking now in this little section of the book. Rob, that's Robert McFarlane, the author, says Bjornar, as we bump down a sidetrack on the west coast of the island, if there is a blowout at one of these proposed rigs, well, it will destroy this coastline. The Gulf Stream is pumping in and out of all the fjords, and the oil is going to be spread everywhere. The Gulf Stream will be the oil's conveyor belt. What Bjornar fears is a version of solastalgia, the term coined by Glenn Albrecht in 2003 to mean a form of psychic or existential distress caused by environmental change. Solastalgia, it's an interesting word. Albrecht was studying the effects of long-term drought and large-scale mining activity on communities in New South Wales when he realized that no word existed to describe the unhappiness of people whose landscapes were being transformed about them by forces beyond their control. He proposed his new term to describe this distinctive kind of homesickness, where the pain of nostalgia arises from moving away. The pain of solastalgia arises from staying put. Where the pain of nostalgia can be mitigated by return, the pain of solastalgia tends to be irreversible. Solastalgia is not a malady specific to the Anthropocene. We might consider John Clare a solastalgistic poet witnessing his native Northamptonshire countryside disrupted by enclosure in the 1810s. But in other words, I thought it was helpful to understand this term of solastalgia, that when things are happening around you and you have no way to address them or to control them, you feel sort of, it's not quite depression, it's sort of a feeling of stuckness, of an inability to do anything, of paralysis. And so then reflecting on all of this, I'm going to quote just a little bit more from Robert Macfarlane. He says, that afternoon, I go down to one of the beaches on the northwest of Andoya. That's the island where he is. A scary shape like a dorsal fin of a shark stands a few hundred yards offshore. Hundreds of seabirds wheel around it. It is low tide, and the sand of the bay is strewn with jetsam, almost all of it plastic. Here, now remind you, this is the farthest reaches of civilization in the Norwegian Arctic. Here, as in the Lofoten's, the density of human debris is shocking. Fishing buoys, toothbrushes, bleach bottles, tangled fishing nets, thousands of unidentifiable shards. I feel sick as I walk the rack line and its litter, appalled by the contrast with the plateau, implicated by my part in the scene. This was once all oil too. Oil, the monstrous transformer, is in all of these things, vital to the manufacture of the plastics that we first synthesized only a century ago. I think of the photographs I have seen recently of hermit crabs on the remote Pacific atoll of Henderson Island. One crab had taken a plastic doll's head as its shell, another an empty tub of Avon night cream. Plastic is the substance that has served as our most perfect container and that now overwhelms our systems of containment. The substances we have made are relentlessly accumulating around us, forming a very present past. Over the last 2 centuries, and especially the last 50 years, our mass production, consumption, and disposal has created an empire of things with its own unruly material afterlife, a swelling topography of scrapped modernity, which, despite ever more effective regimes of disposal, is increasingly confronting us with its pestering presence. Nuclear waste waits in vitrified flasks for the underground tombs into which it might be buried. Seas and coasts thicken with plastic trash. Carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere. And I recall Don DeLillo's laconic, lethal one-liner from his novel Underworld. What we excrete comes back to consume us. So that's not cheery. And I think it builds on sort of what we heard last week, I think. So then we have the situation about what we do about that, right? He continues and he says, each of us is implicated in the effects of the epoch. Each of us an author of its making and its legacies. In the Anthropocene, we cannot easily keep nature at a distance, holding it at arm's length for adoration or inspection. Nature is no longer only a remote peak shining in the sun or a raptor hunting over birch woods. It is also tide lines thickened with drift plastic or methane calthrates decomposing over millions of square miles of warming permafrost. This new nature entangles us in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. I think the sticky strands of self-tightening silken plastic that drip down from the helicopters of the new people at the end of John Wyndham's novel, The Chrysalids, originally entitled A Time for Change. The more we struggle to distance ourselves from the Anthropocene, the more stuck we become. So here's this situation that we're in, right? That's sort of, I love that image at the end. I mean, I don't love it. I mean, I think it's apt, I suppose, would be a better way to put it, of feeling like you're sort of in a sticky kind of web, kind of that you can't sort of extricate yourself from, and that's sort of the situation in which we find ourselves in our day. And so given that, I'm wondering then, can we look at our tradition to have a similar understanding and then try to find out, is there a way forward? Is there any hope in the midst of hopelessness? That's why I labeled this session as as a way of lament, talking about lament and resurrection hope. Is the resurrection hope in the midst of this sort of lament? And so I want to give us a little bit of a headline into the next class, the Romans class, which is going to begin next week. A little commercial for that. But in the 7th chapter and the 8th chapter of the book of Romans, which are sort of in the center of Paul's argument in the letter to the Romans, he writes this. And I'll preface this by saying these two chapters in the tradition, the Christian tradition, at least since the Reformation, have so often been interpreted in very individualistic ways. It's about my sinfulness and my salvation, right? But I would urge us to reframe, given what we've just heard from Robert McFarlane, and that sense of stickiness, being caught in this web of and unable to extricate ourselves from it. To hear Paul's words in that framework, rather than in individualistic sin and salvation language. I know that good doesn't live in me, that is, in my body. The desire to do good is inside of me, but I can't do it. I don't do the good that I want to do, but I do the evil that I don't want to do. But if I do the very thing that I don't want to do, then I'm not the one doing it anymore. Instead, it is sin that lives in me that is doing it. So I find that as a rule, well, actually, I'm going to change this translation because the Greek here, rule is nomen, that is principle or law. I find it to be a law of the universe in a sense almost, that when I want to do what is good, evil is right in there with me. I gladly agree with the law on the inside, but I see a different law at work in my body. It wages a war against the law of my mind and takes me prisoner with the law of sin that is in my body. I'm a miserable human being. Who will deliver me from this dead corpse? Thank God, who through Jesus Christ our Lord. So that I'm a slave to God's law in my mind, but I'm a slave to sin's law in my body. And so what a lot of biblical scholars are saying today is that what Paul's talking about is not Paul and not an individual person, but rather he's trying to talk about the human condition, the condition of human sinfulness that has gotten us to this point. And in this case, talking about the ideas of global destruction that we are all enmeshed in. And we can talk about all kinds of other related elements in that massive web of sinfulness. But in this case, talking about the global situation that we are in with the destruction of all of creation. And when he's talking about the law, I think we can think not just sort of like the individual precepts of the Jewish law, but really what I think he's talking about there is the whole way of life that God intended from the beginning of creation, that we have sort of taken ourselves away from and decided to go on a very different route. that we could call idolatrous, actually, that we know better, that the creature knows better than the creator. And we worship the things that are created rather than the creator of all things, blessed be he. So what then is the further point of Paul's argument? He says in chapter 8, very famous, so now there isn't any condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. The law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you free from the law of sin and death. Now the way we live is based on the Spirit, not based on selfishness. People whose lives are based on selfishness think about selfish things, but people whose lives are based on the Spirit think about things that are related to the Spirit. The attitude that comes from selfishness leads to death, but the attitude that comes from the Spirit leads to life and peace. So the attitude that comes from selfishness is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law because it can't. People who are self-centered aren't able to please God, but you aren't self-centered. Instead, you are in the Spirit, if in fact God's Spirit lives in you. Then he says in verse 18 of chapter 8, I believe that the present suffering is nothing to be compared to the coming glory that is going to be revealed to us. The whole creation waits breathless with anticipation for the revelation of God's sons and daughters. Creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice. It was the choice of the one who subjected it, but in the hope that the creation itself will be set free from slavery to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of God's children. We know that the whole creation is groaning together and suffering labor pains up until now. And it's not only the creation. We ourselves, who have the Spirit as the first crop of the harvest, also groan inside as we wait to be adopted and for our bodies to be set free. We are saved in hope. And if we see that what we hope for we are saved in hope. If we see what we hope for, that isn't hope. Who hopes for what they already see? But if we hope for what we don't see, we wait for it with patience. Now, I think Paul is giving us some wisdom here in terms of, I think he sees very correctly the situation. Now, people could argue, well, environmental problems were not present in the Roman Empire in which Paul was speaking. Well, we beg to differ, actually. Whole networks of the Roman roads that actually Paul used to his advantage went through whole swaths of countryside and had to be dug deep and were very wide. They went through forests. Whole populations of animals were removed from elements or places in the empire and brought to Rome simply for the purpose of the gladiatorial games. It's believed that species that existed in the Roman Empire became extinct under Roman domination. Pollution was not unknown in the cities of ancient Rome, air pollution. So Paul knew about environmental degradation in his own context. Now, of course, it's not our context, but in his context. And so I can't help but think that when he says the whole creation is groaning in birth pains to be revealed or to be renewed and to come to some new creation, he is expressing the similar longing to what we might be feeling as well. And he does raise this ability to hope. So we come from lament into hope. And so to that end, I'd like to move to another work by two people who I'm very excited are going to be presenters during our Roman class. And we're gonna be hearing from Sylvia Kiesma and Brian Walsh over 2 weeks of our Roman class. Then we're also going to be hearing from another biblical scholar as well during our Romans class. But these two folks are really are fantastic. And their book, Romans Disarmed, is another one of those sort of blow your context out to a whole new way of thinking. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what Sylvia and Brian talk about in their book. Again, called Romans Disarmed. And this is in a section that they refer to as From Lament to Resurrection Hope. And the conceit of the chapter is that they are using an imagined interlocutor who is asking questions, and they are responding to these questions. And so the question that is raised, I think, is very pertinent to what we've just been talking about, where perhaps many of us are. I have a sinking feeling that if I start asking these kinds of questions, that is about, for example, environmental degradation, which is one of the contexts of this particular chapter, I'm going to get depressed. Okay, so this is their response. We wish depression on no one. Depression is debilitating and paralyzing. It leaves us with no resources with which to respond to the admittedly depressing state of affairs in which we find ourselves. But you are right in seeing that honestly asking these kinds of questions about our eating habits, about pretty much everything else in the system of global capitalism, is a very sobering thing. That is why any serious engagement with the world of ecological wounds must begin in lament. Is that interesting? And then the questioner says, another reason to engage in lament? Yes, you see, lament is necessary because when we engage in lament, we are crying out for things to be different. We are holding up before God the hope and expectation of another world, and we are asking God to bring such a world into being. Lament calls God back repeatedly to the need for justice for creation and humanity. And then the questioner asks, are you saying that lament is an act of hope? Yes, lament is an act of hope. In fact, it is an act of passionate expectation. While depression leaves us stuck in the brokenness of the present, lament entails a vision of life that calls us forward. Now, incidentally, maybe this is that sense of stuckness and sort of the depressive state that we're talking about in the McFarland book. So lament entails a vision of life that calls us forward. Remember how Paul depicts creation in Romans 8. Creation is not only groaning in birth pangs, but also waiting with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. And Paul describes us as groaning inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. You see, lament is always asking, how long? Because lament is voiced in defiant hope of a restored world. The creation knows that when the children of God to begin to live out their calling is the image bearers who will care for creation, then creation itself will be set free. And as believers, we long for that day when we will be those true children and our very bodies will be redeemed. And then the questioner asks, is this what you call living in the tragic gap? Yes, the phrase is from Parker Palmer. The tragic gap is that space between what creation can and will be and the place that we find ourselves in now. We deeply long for that place of healing, of forgiveness, of restoration, but we aren't there yet. And so we live with the grief of knowing how it could be, but having to deal with the deathly reality of how things actually are. So the questioner asks, well, that's what depresses me. The gap is unbearable and I find myself paralyzed, stuck in a moment that I can't get out of. I just don't know what to do. The response that they give is, here's the thing, living in the tragic gap doesn't actually get better if you are offered a list of rules to follow, as if to say, if you care for creation, then do this and this and this, and you'll be fine. We are stuck in a moment that we can't get out of because the story of our lives, the story of the civilizational progress and the affluence embodied in the produce section of our grocery stores has reached a dead end. This is a story that provides no way forward. What we need is a transformed imagination, not a list of rules. The grand story that Paul is telling and reinterpreting at the heart of the empire invites us to be taken up in a vision that calls us forward, calls us in, so that we can't help but want to live into the healing and the redemption that God offers. And so just to conclude here, she's then talking about, that in her experience, that most of what Christianity was all about is going to heaven when you die, right? And she says, if your deepest longing is to live with Jesus in heaven, then you don't really have any powerful desires for what the world can be. Heaven kind of eclipses earth. But you've made it sound as though God's vision of shalom includes the earth, not just now, but in the future. And then the authors continue. Where does Paul ever say in the epistle to the Romans that Christians' eternal destiny is to live with Jesus in heaven? Nowhere. And how could he even imagine such a thing? It is not found anywhere in the Bible, nor would such a vision have ever occurred to the apostle. We need to remember that Paul's most foundational understanding of human identity and calling is rooted in the stories so vividly portrayed in Genesis 2. There we meet a God with dirty fingernails. The creator kneels down into the earth and forms an earth creature. God takes Adama, the earth, and makes Adam, the earth creature. The earth creature formed from the earth is who we are. Humans are from the humus. Randy Woodley describes us as walking earth. But it isn't that we're just earth creatures. The Spirit of God breathes out and fills our lungs, and the earth creature begins to live. We're creatures made of earth and the living breath of God. Genesis 2 goes on to paint a captivating picture of where we are and what God has to do. This God of the dirty fingernails plants a garden for us. The images of a carefully tended, not of a carefully tended ornamental garden, but a forest garden. The divine gardener causes trees to grow that are pleasant to the sight, trees for delight, trees that are good for food. And then God places the earth creature in this forest garden to till it and to keep it. And the earth creature bears the image of the divine gardener through gardening. The human bears the image of the divine homemaker by being at home and making home, protecting and enhancing the world as habitat to all creatures. The point of many of the prophetic texts that Paul alludes to in Romans is that we have forgotten who we are. The earth creatures have failed to live up to the calling we were given, this calling to make earth fully our home. This is what the language about exchanging the image of the living God is about. We were created as image bearers to engage in faithful rule over the creation, and we have abdicated our calling. We have failed to be the ones who have imaged God, and we have forgotten our roots in the earth. We are no longer earth creatures, but death bringers. We have replaced till and keep with take and destroy. We have supplanted serve and observe with dominate and discard. Well, I think that let me just give a little end on a more hopeful note here. But as we have seen, creation isn't the only one waiting. Paul says that those of us who have the first fruits of the Spirit, who have been enlivened anew by the life-giving breath of God, know our calling. We know who we are. And so we too groan as we wait for the redemption of our bodies. We are longing and groaning with creation. We are waiting for resurrection. And in talking about the redemption of our bodies, Paul says something not just about who we are, but who we are called to be. You see, we are the earth creatures, and our destiny in the Bible is never to live for eternity apart from our bodies in the earth. That is why the book of Revelation describes our hope in terms of a new heaven and a new earth where God comes to dwell on the new earth with humanity, with the earth creatures. Then God will wipe away every tear from our eyes. Death will be no more, and mourning and crying and pain will be no more. So that concludes that section on a little bit more of lament moving into resurrection hope. So I hope I haven't bored you with lots of reading this morning, but but I think that when we look at the biblical worldview from this perspective, I think that there's a lot of wisdom within that biblical worldview that we can mine and understand the vision of moving from lament into hope, and that lament is actually a hopeful thing because we can see something that can be different. We know it can be different, and that can maybe energize us. Now, you know, I mean, the thing about Bjornar in Underland in the Norwegian Arctic is that, you know, the work of him and his fellow advocates for the environment actually bore fruit, and legislation in terms of controlling for drilling and sonic testing and all of those things that were destroying the environment. There was actually progress that was made. Now he says, you know, in the book also, well, I know that we made progress, but I'm seeing that they're trying to get back in and do it again now, right? So the progress is always incremental and maybe 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But I think to overcome that solastalgia that he talks about, that how do we extricate ourselves from something that we feel we have no power over? We have to have this sense of hope that I think faith brings us, in the sense of the new creation, in the sense of being earth creatures who embody the vision of Genesis and the story of the Bible rather than the story of empire. And I've been talking a long time, so I'm just going to throw that out and see if anybody has any sort of response to any of all of that. And I think it really, by the way, Kelly, I thought of you because I thought so much of what you said last week really dovetailed into a lot of this week. Philip, I think you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Thank you, Father. Of course, I have something to say with my big mouth. I always have something to say. But your talk this morning really just set my mind on fire. Just a couple of observations. I was really struck by when you talked about this Norwegian fellow whose name escapes me, that he had a psychotic break in the midst of this, which makes perfect sense to me. One of the things that I realized a few years ago that I just witnessing humankind has proven this to be true. You know, we are indeed made of earth. And there are generations of people now alive who've never touched the earth, who've gone from their homes. If they're lucky, they have wood floors, and that's about the closest they come to actually physically touching the earth. We walk out of our houses across pavement to get to our cars, to drive across pavement to someplace, and the actual physical earth, particularly for urban dwellers. So, I mean, I can't, and I live in a, you know, fairly, not rural, but I live in a, and since the lockdown, I can't remember the last time I physically touched the planet. And that collectively over a length of time cannot not have had an effect on us, on our psyche. And you live a whole life that way. A plastic bottle is like a tree branch to you. You know, that's the context of that, because you don't have any experience with an actual tree branch, with earth. And I think that this can't not affect our psyche. And then just the other thing about lamenting this, you know, another thing that I've been sort of preoccupied with the past couple of years in my own personal journey is the difference between grief and grievance. You know, and we don't grieve well. And when I get close to actual grief, so many times that feels so overwhelming to me that I'll veer off into grievance, and I'll get into resentment and raging about how awful everything is, because the feeling of the actual grief feels so overwhelming to me that I feel it's going to swamp me. But if I'll remember the cross, you know, if anything grants us permission to actually grieve, it's the cross. And if I'll actually just go into grief itself and sit with that, you know, I'll cry for a little while, and then I'll blow my nose and make something to eat and go on about my life, and something will start to change inside of me. If I'll allow grief and actual lamenting to take place inside of me, that transforms me. But if every time I get close to that place, it feels so scary, and I veer off into grievance again instead of staying with grief, it's just like a hamster wheel that keeps turning and it never progresses. And I think that mankind in general, humankind, are in a way sort of stuck in that grievance loop, as opposed to actually going into the deep grief and lamenting of how we got here. And that lamentation, that grieving, is the only way through this. And that's the angel with the flaming sword, I think, that keeps us out of Eden. That's my 2 cents about this.
Say more about that in terms of the angel part. Unpack that a little bit.
Well, it's like our whole journey is back into the garden, you know, coming full circle back into the garden again. And I think that angel that confronts us with the flaming sword is the authenticity of our human brokenness. And for me to fully just accept that mantle, take that upon myself, and let that sort of tenderize my heart, it puts me in contact with the rest of the created world. And then I can ease my way back into the garden again. But when I see that angel with the flaming sword, my first reaction is overwhelming fear. And it seems like a confrontation. And it's actually an invitation. If I will sort of kneel before that frightening image, the angel with the sword to me represents everything I think, all the brokenness I think I and us as a species and us as a planet can't get past. There's no reason in the world why the problems that face us have to be a fait accompli. We can heal this with God's help, but a choice has to be made. You know, and that choice has to be made daily and hourly with it about my own behavior. And my fear of that angel with the flaming sword will tell me I can't, it's locked off from me. I can't get back. I can't return to any sort of Edenic existence. And I think in a way, that's the task God has given us, to bring about the kingdom on earth to the best of our own stumbling ability. And so to me, that's what the angel with the flaming sword has come to represent for me.
But just to, in case there are some folks, especially folks viewing in the St. John's site, viewing the class, who may not get the reference, that in the book of Genesis, in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, when human beings make their fundamental rupture with their relationship with God, and they are forced to leave Eden, right? That there is a terrible angel with a flaming sword that keeps humanity from coming back into Eden. That's the sort of startling image that is used. So they move from the lush garden into the wilderness, where they have to scratch out their living in that sort of the hard scrapple life of farming, and the earth doesn't yield the way it would have in the good relationship and that sort of thing. And so you're talking about that image for you it shows that separation and the grief of what we have lost, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And that actually causes you some fear, right? Yeah. and that, of course, as Christians, we see that the gate that gate has been opened, right? If we believe in the work of Jesus to heal the world, right, and to be the as the New Testament says, the pioneer of a new creation. So that's the one that we can look to help us on that journey, right? The other thing, speaking of that, Philip, and this just came into my mind. This is apropos of nothing that you said, but for some reason this morning, that the story came into my mind of Jesus calming the sea from the Gospels, and I realized something different about that. I guess I always used to think of that story as Jesus dominating the natural powers with his divine power, right? That he's going to conquer them. But then I realized, no, that's not what's going on at all in that story. It's about the one who's the pioneer of the new creation is working with the seas and the storms. They're friends of his, and so they cooperate. It's a story of a loving relationship between the creator and the creature, not about domination. And that just sort of like, oh yeah, it's sort of like that just changed my mind in terms of how I see that story and perhaps other stories as well.
What stuck out to me with what you were reading was when he said that, where did we get the idea of an idyllic or a heaven as being someplace outside of ourselves, or to go to heaven, that this
Right.
paradise.
Right.
But what stuck out to me was Jesus's words to the thief on the cross next to him. He says, this day you will be with me in paradise. So we are earth people, and I agree with that. And we definitely have a position of stewardship, which we have not done. I mean, that was given to us back in the Garden of Eden in the first place, that we were to take care and tend the garden. It was part of our charge for being here. Mm-hmm. And we have not done that. We've and the part that, you were talking before about another song that you heard about, that we need to get ourselves back to the garden. We can't do that. I don't think we are going to be able to do that at all. We got ourselves out of the garden, but we can't get ourselves back. And it has a lot to do with that angel with the flaming sword. But I think with God's help and instruction, that if we ask him what it is we need to do and understand that it's not us doing it, because at the Tower of Babel, they got into that problem as well. We are going to do this. We are going to build a tower to heaven. We're going to get there. And it wasn't supposed to happen. So it didn't. So unless we understand that us getting back to the garden, or us getting to God or to heaven, is not something that we can accomplish on our own with merely our own intellect, then we're going to have a problem.
Right. I think you're right about that. I mean, the one thing I think about the thing about paradise, of course, is that what, the sort of this gets into sort of the theological weeds a little bit, but the sense of the hope that people have who die, right? That there is something for them to hope for. And it's not just that their spirits are going to go to some airy fairy place someplace, but that, what we say in the creed is we believe in the resurrection of the body, that there will be that resurrection hope ultimately for the Christian entails a total restoration of the new heaven and the new earth, and you know, the sort of the paradise is sort of like the sort of place where everybody's waiting with eager longing, along with the creation, for all of this to come to its fullness, right? So there's that piece of it, but definitely what you're saying as well. You know, I think that's what I think Brian and Sylvia are talking about in their book when they talk about this is not about a set of rules.
Right.
It's about a new imagination, and who fuels that? The Holy Spirit of God, the Spirit of life, can fuel that new imagination, right? And I will say that you know, the Spirit of God is shed abroad throughout the whole world, and so it's not, you know, what we have to give up the sense that, well, it's only us Christians who are going to come up with the brilliant ideas. No, that's not really true. In fact, we might be the followers on that one instead of the instigators. I hope not, but you know, we have to look around and see where the Spirit of God is blowing around, and wherever we see it, jump in and join it. You know, the Spirit's already out ahead of us. The risen Jesus is already out ahead of us. We have to find out where that is and catch new visions that are going to help to energize and allow the Holy Spirit to give us the capacity for doing that. And that's exactly that was what I was trying to say earlier on when I was talking about, you know, McFarland's sense of stuckness, of being in that sticky plastic web, right? It is exactly the situation, and that's what he's talking about earlier about that sense of not of nostalgia but solastalgia, that we aren't just longing for somewhere over the rainbow, but we're realizing right now that we can't get out of where we're at least on our own inclinations, and so that's why I think it's essential for people of the Spirit, to earth creatures who are also, remember, people who have God-breathed life in them, to engage in how the Spirit is moving in the world and opening ourselves up to that. Yeah, and some of that has to do with spiritual surrender, and I don't mean that like, you know, you don't do anything, right? But the spiritual practice of surrender that Saint Teresa of the Little Flower used to talk about, and she used to say that she, you know, she just sort of she would surrender her own self and her own will and her own imagination to the will of God and to the Spirit, and invited God to take care of it and to allow herself and to be an instrument of God's movement in the world, not her own movement in the world, right? And so that's why I think, you know, sometimes I think when we hear these terms like spiritual surrender, it feels like we're not going to do anything. That's not at all what that concept means, right? What it means is that I realize who I am and my place in the world, and I realize that I don't have all the answers, and I realize that if I just go off half-cocked, I'm not going to achieve anything.
Right.
But a prayer that I often say is one it's attributed to her, but I don't think she actually ever said it. St. Teresa is, "My Jesus, I surrender myself to you. Now you take care of it." And what that means is I'm not just going to sit here passively and let you take care of it. It means, okay, I don't know how to get out of this.
Right.
I need a new imagination.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's help me figure that out, and help all of us to figure it out, right?
And it's also about being a co-laborer with Christ. You know, we were never supposed to do all of this by ourselves. We were supposed to work with and to be surrendered to work with.
I mean, as Mother Lynn, if I mean, you don't have to say this, I'm not put you on the spot, but so you can say pass if you want. But do you have anything to add about the spiritual practice of surrendering to the will of God in the mystical tradition, or in Saint Teresa, for example? Because I know that's something you've done some study on and reflection on.
Yeah, and I think I'm a real Anglican when it comes to things like this. And you know, when you're speaking of the Romans passage, I think it has to do with exactly what you're talking about the whole creation. But I think that this whole movement of stuckness has to start from interiorly. So that surrender, that awareness that we are powerless is the first step to going beyond to the big picture. So I think it's a balance of internal and external. So we have to begin with a very personal thing. We have to see that passage in Romans very personally first, in order to get to the place of feeling completely hopeless and powerless, and to admit that, and to then invite God to move through us. And I think most all the mystics talk about that, about the surrender being willing for the Spirit to move through us and use us for, as you said, this new imagination, this new way of understanding things, because we keep grinding away at the same old thing. And it you know, what is it they say in 12 step? It's doing the same old thing and expecting a different outcome is the definition of insanity. We keep trying the old things, and it doesn't work. And so we need that new imagination, but it has to start with our interior life first. We've got to work on the inside in order to avail ourselves of that power that can move through us.
You know, when you're talking about 12 steps too, just as you were referring to that about not realizing that we are powerless, you know, and of course that step one in the big book,
Exactly.
I'm powerless over my addiction, and in the big book that was about alcoholism, but something just came to me literally as you were speaking, that, oh my gosh, using a Southern Californianism, that we are addicts.
Yes.
And we're powerless over our addiction to the imperial way of life, and this lifestyle of consumption. And we are addicts. We have to realize, we have to say, I am an addict. We have to say that, to your point.
And I'm powerless over that.
And I am powerless over my addiction. Just,
Exactly.
literally, I thought of that when you said that, right? I mean, that's absolutely true.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you have to start at the beginning by realizing that about your own interior self. And then you can apply it to the big picture of environmental issues, or whatever other issues we have to deal with, the racial issues, the justice issues. But we've got to begin with ourselves.
Yeah. Wow.
Might it be something that we could look into for future study of Father Mark, about possibly looking at the 12 steps and how it applies to our Christianity also. I think that many of us are, especially through this lockdown situation, are experiencing a somewhat of a helplessness, in a sense, bewildered. I don't know. It's that feeling of. I was looking at the term solastalgia. It talks about homesickness, a homesickness you have when you're still at home, and it's. I guess it's a somewhat of a form of depression, and I know that we've talked about ways of trying to center ourselves and seek a higher source to help us through some of these things. But it at a point, I guess it, for me at least, it just gets to be kind of overwhelming, you know, especially as we look at the state of things in the world. This you were saying, Father Mark, about progress is always incremental.
Mhm.
That what we see, in a sense, is almost for the moment. You know, I know I'm rambling, but it's just so many things going through my mind about what we're experiencing right now through all of this, through the lockdown, through looking at where we are as a nation, as a people, um, especially as a people who care for other people. You know, recognizing differences, but uh, but going beyond that, and just being open to to who the person is, regardless to, you know, what their background and skin color and all this, whatever. I mean, it's just so, all of it is so interconnected, and it's just almost a feeling of overwhelmness, uh, with trying to deal with all of this at one time.
I'm wondering if um, Kelly and or Eric have anything to add at this point, based on maybe on what you were saying last week, based on what we're talking about this week.
Yeah. I'll let Eric talk too if he wants to. I just jumped right
Oh,
in.
you go first, Kelly. I'll say
Um,
something. Yeah.
I mean, first of all, thank you for doing this. This is a great roundup, and I say yes, yes, yes to everything that's been said. This is good. This is reflecting a lot of what I've been working through myself. And to get back to like what Phil was talking about, I mean, I think the depression and the grief are real, and that everything in our culture tells us that it's trivial, or to just, you know, stop whining and get on, or go out, you know, if you feel sad, go out and do something. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, until we acknowledge our grief, you know, and I also want to say to anybody listening that environmental depression and environmental grief is very real. I mean, it's a sub practice psychologically. You can get therapy for it. We're told, you know, that we're being silly, I think, you know, and that can be anything from like bursting into tears suddenly when you're, you know, drinking your coffee and you just see the latest bad news. You know, there's always something every day, something horrible. Or, you know, that desire to skip over it and not read it at all because it's so horrible you can't take hearing one more horrible thing. Or being upset because an old tree in your neighborhood is cut down and nobody seems to care and you miss it. You know, like, these are real feelings, and everything in our society says, push that aside, ignore it, it's not important. Look what's on TV, you know, look what Donald Trump is saying. That's important, you know, and this is important. So I think denial is a temptation, and denial is a way of hardening ourselves, and it's an impediment to progress. So like we've been talking about, like softening into that grief, accepting that grief. And, you know, that's the first step to healing, you know, and then that's what opens up the spiritual doors, as, you know, Mother Lynn's been talking about. And, you know, we're all on the same page here. But yeah, I do want to just put in just a vote of affirmation for the grief we feel. And it's not only the environmental grief, but it's like the social grief. You know, the world is full of pain. You know, even if it doesn't touch us directly, you know, we're all connected and we're feeling that somewhere deep inside, you know, and that's real. I think imagination and spirit are very closely aligned, and we don't investigate that enough. Like when Father Mark was talking about Jesus and the waters, and the waters settling around him and the storms quieting around him, like how much of that is like the world reflecting Jesus's inner state? And then how much of our world is a reflection of our inner state? And how, you know, and that's not just like new agey play stuff. That's like, you know, if we had our inner houses in order, how much would the outer house improve? You know, like these are all things to think about. Our creation is groaning. We are groaning. You know, we are part of creation. We're all the same thing, right? So again, it's all one, as we say. But it really is all one. So I love the idea of spiritual surrender. I find the confession in the Anglican tradition useful. I always am very moved when we have confession during our Mass and we ask for forgiveness for what we've done and what we've left undone. And my mind tends to go not to the small interpersonal things as much as that goes to these larger world issues. And it helps me. So, you know, there's probably some tools just in our usual toolbox that can help with that grieving process and acceptance process. I love the 12-step stuff. I think that's a really interesting direction to take this. So I have a lot of thoughts. I'm just very pleased and I'm happy to hear all of you reflecting my own thoughts back to me. I feel like I am in a community. It's great.
Eric, do you have anything to add briefly before we close? Can't hear you, Eric.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, this is all reminding me of Mark Fisher, the writer that I brought up last week.
Right.
He wrote a book called Capitalist Realism, just about this inability to see a different future. He was sort of obsessed actually with popular culture, looking at movies that, particularly science fiction movies that all kind of look the same in our culture, that don't have an ability to see a different future. They're all kind of like Mad Max, you know, they're all this sort of dystopian future, and there's an inability to see something different. And what he was working on when he died was a book called Acid Communism. And I think he was being provocative as a writer by saying, like, we needed to work together and we need a spiritual break. That's the acid and the acid communism, basically. In our own tradition, I think what's interesting is we come together to drink. We can't do it now, interestingly, but we come together to share the body and blood of Christ as a community. So yeah, I think it's an and. I mean, yes, it's important we work on ourselves, but right now we need to come together, be provocative like Mark Fisher was, and really challenge the world, change the world in a fundamental way. I keep thinking lately of listening to the voices of young people right now who can see a different way of doing things and are making very radical changes right now and challenging past generations to really think of things in a new way. And we have a little opening in this crisis right now to fundamentally challenge our economic system, to challenge the way we view each other interpersonally and in terms of race and class, and to change the world so that we can have a future that isn't, you know, burned up by climate change.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, Mother Lynn, why don't we give you the last word here before we close out?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I just, as you were talking, Eric, I was thinking about, you know, my own personal interior life recently has had a lot to do with my confession about not caring enough about, you know, what's obviously been going on in the environment and in racially and with the flu and everything. And so, you know, the inside and the outside are very much connected. It's not like this private little personal sin thing. It's about feeling that sense of responsibility that I have ignored. I have not paid enough attention to. And so I think by doing that, becoming aware of that interiorly, now I'm available to God to, in who knows what. I just keep saying to God, where do you want to use me? Because I mean, there's so much going on, and I want to help fix it, but I know that there's probably one or two places where I will be most useful. So I just need to be open to what comes across my path or what nudges I get. And so it's all kind of tangled up, the interior and the exterior.
Thank you. Well, we need to conclude. since we're at 10:52 right now, and so wanting to meet our 11 o'clock service time, followed by coffee hour. Once again, everybody. But let me just put in a ad for starting next week. We start our traditional adult vacation Bible school next week, which we always have every summer. And this time, for the first time in 6 years, we are going back to the book of Romans. And what I'm really excited about this time is that for 3 of the weeks, from July 12th through August 9th, we're having 3 extraordinary Bible scholars. For 2 weeks, we're going to have, 1 week we're going to have Brian Walsh, and then the next week we're going to have Sylvia Casement. And they're going to talk about the book Romans Disarmed that I referred to today, and their take on the book of Romans. But that's going to be starting next week. We're going to start out with just sort of like an overview to get sort of the lay of the land as we travel through Romans. And then the final week, we're going to have somebody by the name of Michael Gorman, who has been described as the preeminent Pauline scholar in the United States. Really excited about him too, being here with us at our 9:30 hour on the 9th of August. And then the in-between week, it will either be us all or there may be a surprise guest. I don't know yet. So we'll have to figure that out. Philip, you raise your hand before we leave.
Since it's Vacation Bible School, can we have one of those felt boards that we can put,
Maybe you can develop that.
We can do arts and crafts.
That's great. Okay, everyone. Well, we'll see you. Hopefully, those of you who can be at church at 11 o'clock, see you at coffee hour afterwards, and definitely see you next week. And Felicia is going to be the leader of evening prayer on Thursday evening this week. Look forward to seeing you all in the coming moments. Bye for now.
Peace be with you.
Bye.